child. So I would like to say I am the father of 4 children, and to the Senator's point, I have 1 adopted child, 3 biological and 1 adopted child. Fathers bond after the child is born. Mothers quite often will bond with that child from the time they feel the first little butterflies or little air bubbles they talk about, you know, those first things that they feel in their stomach. But as fathers, in my circumstance, I can't speak for everyone, it's not until you can actually see and hold and feel and that the bonding really starts. You get a little bit with listening and feeling those first kicks, but otherwise you don't. But my point here is that I would have hoped that the legislation might have had something in it that put a requirement to actually do with that time that which it was given to you for. This is not a reward for getting someone pregnant that 9 months later you get an additional 3 weeks off. And I want to agree with Senator Worrell on that. I really think that it would be put in the wrong light to be seen that way. And I think that it would be good for us to find some ways that they could enforce that. And perhaps one of those ways might be, sir, if in fact that father who has had the benefit of those 3 weeks off is later finds himself before the court for not fulfilling duties otherwise, whether that is in the not paying for the support or some other way, that there might have been some teeth to go back and say, but hold on a minute, you got the benefit of 3 weeks off and were paid by the government of Barbados and you're not fulfilling your duties in this other way. But it's hard for me to attach those things together. We do at the end of the day have the cultural reality in Barbados and in certain parts of our society. The children are growing up without the fathers being present in their life, and we're all paying the price for that, and that is unfortunate. So, sir, as I said, I think that this bill is appropriate. I'm glad to see that we are joining the global right thinkers, maybe, in recognizing the role that fathers have to play with raising their children. But I do think that it is not a reward for getting someone pregnant. That is the easy part. Being a father is the difficult part, and you must then find some way that we know that these fathers are using that time as it was intended to support the mom in those first few weeks when it is extremely difficult. And I spent a few more minutes on this. My personal situation with having a mother who had 3 C-sections. In that first week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks after birth, just lifting the child is near impossible. And I was lucky. I had the benefit of 2 grandmothers that were alive and many different aunties who would help. Many people are born and the mother does not have that level of support. So I have lived it. I know what it is like and how important the father would be there. So I think that this is essential. And I did it at a time, as many of people in here I'm sure have as well, when there was no paternity leave as such, but maybe you took holidays. That's when you took your holidays, right? And even if you didn't take your holidays, you know, you took 1 or 2 of the shifts at night for the feedings or the changing, and you went to work the next day a bit tired, but you did what you could. So, sir, with those few words, I support this bill. I do hope that we can, in some ways, change the culture, that it is not a reward for having a birth, but rather it is an obligation, a duty, and it helps us to raise better people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Barlow. Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, afternoon to my colleagues. I believe I'm taking the words from Senator Boyce. I'm compelled to speak on this matter, albeit just for a few moments, because it is landmark legislation for us in this country to recognize the role of fathers and the importance of the role of fathers in the rearing of our children. Barbados traditionally being a matriarchal society, it was generally almost felt, or somewhere in the minds of men, that the children belong to the women and that they are to look after them. And I'm glad that we've taken this step to not only impress upon our men the importance of their role in the nurturing of children, but also to seek. And I pray that this legislation will, in some way, help to build family life in this part, in our country, because for too long there has been the notion that, and even in the mind of some men, that their role is simply to contribute a few ounces of biological matter and a couple of breakfast things later on when they're needed. But the reality is that what we're seeing, without the empirical evidence, what we're seeing in our society today in terms of, as one minister recently pointed out, most of the people going into our prisons are teenagers. And it says something about the stability of our family life in this country. And I know that though we're talking about the early stages, I believe those early stages are very important. Senator Mallalieu would have given his experience 3 times over. I can only speak about it once, sir. Once that I'm certain, very certain about. Let me just make that. I heard a comment over here. So once that I'm certainly certain about. No, I'm saying that for the gallery here. I had the opportunity to bond with my daughter before she was born because I realized that in speaking to them, they respond to your voice and so on. And on the day when she was born, she was crying down the hospital, and as soon as she heard my voice, she stopped. Just went very quiet because it was a familiar voice that she knew. And in my line of work, there was no paternity leave then, but I was not at as busy a parish that I'm at now. And I had some time to be home with her when her mother had to go back to work. I remember one day I took her with me and I went into an establishment. And when I went to the counter to speak to the young lady there, she said, that's your child? I said, yes, it is. Where's her mother? I said, well, her mother is at work. And she left her with you? Because it seemed rare that a father will have a child that young walking around with. But I hope that that becomes the norm in our community where men are bonding with their children and building that critical bond at those early stages. And though the 3 weeks is a short time, it is what we can afford at this point in time, but I pray that in time we can extend it, where our men will have a longer period of time, not only to bond with their children, but also to share in that moment with the mothers as in those early stages of life, and to support and assist in the caring and raising of the children. I believe that this will go a very long way, though we may not be able to put a finger on it now, in terms of enhancing family life within our community. And one of the things that we really need to focus on now is family life. I want to commend Senator Worrell for his presentation and some of the issues he would have raised. I would have been coming down in my car from Mass when he spoke about false declarations and so on. And I was just joking that sometimes that may not be the fault of the father. But that's the reality of the society in which we live as well. But I want to commend him for making that critical point that, though he would have had this political slant, making the critical point that this is an investment in our children and in our families in this nation. And I do not believe that $12 million or even $15 million a year is too much to invest at that critical stage in terms of fostering family life and impressing upon fathers the importance of the role that they have to play in their children. Because the reality is that if it is not done then, and there's no real bond being developed with these children, then perhaps we'll be paying out that $15 million somewhere else, where we do not want to be paying it out. As I would have said in the speech some time ago, the words of the prophet Haggai should ring in our ears constantly, that we do not earn money to put them into a bag with holes, that we make sure that what we do is done for the betterment and development of our people. And that is something Barbados has always been known for, the development of people. And recognizing that a few weeks away from work is not going to close the business. We've seen that through COVID. All the time we used to spend running around and having to be in the office and this and that and the next, you realize a lot of it was a waste of time. And some things can be done more efficiently and just as efficiently in a shorter space of time. I would even advocate sometime down the road for a 4-week work day where people can just spend some time detoxing from the busyness of life and spend some time building family life and improving the happiness index of our country, because we spend so much time working like the hamster in the little thing, just going around and doing absolutely nothing at the end of it, you know. And so this is good legislation, a good step in the right direction. I want to encourage all Barbados to embrace this, but also the men, as they've heard. Yes, we call it a benefit, but recognize it is just what is expected of you to help to care for your child. And so we're giving you that space to be there for that period of bonding with child and mother, and to fulfill your role as a father in our community. So with those few words, I wish to thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Roberts. Senator Trim.
Mr. President, colleagues, I rise in support of the Family Leave Bill 2025. It is a piece of legislation that, in my view, represents one of the most important ways and one of the most important steps that the administration and this government has taken in recent years to rebalance how we as a society treat work, family, and care. I do so because when I speak on this bill, I do so without any children of my own, but with deep awareness that in many senses this bill goes beyond pregnancy and even beyond policy and the paperwork that we see before us. I do so because what we are debating is not simply about family leave, but it really is about whether we as a society have the capacity or the will to reimagine the world that we have always known and the systems that quietly shape how we live, love, and labor. It is about fairness and justice and recognition that care work is work too. Work that for a very long time has been done primarily by women, silently and without pause or praise. Mr. President, so this moment for me invites us to consider that we should share and transform that care work that is done into a collective responsibility. A lot of times I think about the world that we live in, particularly my generation when I'm on social media seeing some of the conversations, and the world that is now much more progressive than what my parents entered or my grandparents may have foreseen, but one that is still very much bound in traditional ideals and values, ones that we often disagree with. For example, when I left university, having a child was the furthest thing from my mind. I very much viewed it as something that I would do down the road. It was not a priority because I was very much intent on getting a career and building a nest so that I could take care of a child in a real and meaningful way. And so just the idea that this bill speaks primarily to young people is one of those outdated ideals, particularly because we see now that in a world where before we talked about women having children before 30, and at 30 the sky was falling and you couldn't have kids, we see women entering their 40s and now starting the journey of maternity because that is part of the progress that we have experienced. I also know that I grew up in a household where I saw the burden and the beauty of care, and I often think of my mother as a married single woman, because while my father lived with us, a lot of the responsibility of taking care of the children, the housework, the planning, the emotional labor, going to parent-teachers meeting, it was done by my mother. When we host back-to-school programs, oftentimes what we see primarily would be mothers accompanying their children. And this isn't to say, because we assume when we see this that mothers are single parents or that there's no man in the household. It isn't to say that there is no man in the household. It is to say that traditionally we have gifted, not even gifted, I want to say, we have pushed care onto women under the idea that women are naturally nurturers and men are protectors, even though we have come such a long way. And so my mother carried it without complaint, like many women in her generation, and even many women today, because that is simply how the world works. And if I don't do it, then who will? And so while I honor her strength and the strength of other women like her, I made a very quiet vow to myself that I would not replicate what I saw, and I did not accept that as what should be. And I know that many of my counterparts in my generation do not. I also say this knowing that not every home looks like mine, that there were families where fathers were active and went and played on the, took their children to dentist appointments and were at parent-teachers meeting and were very much involved. But I saw this as the exception and not the rule. And so when I think about fatherhood and should I have children, the kind of father I would want my children to have, it is one where a presence of a father is not a novelty. It is not something that we swoon about. And at some point in time, I stopped swooning when I saw a father with his child. Not because it's not a beautiful thing to see, but really and truly because it is not something that should be revolutionary. Because it should be a standard to have active fathers actively parenting. I want a Barbados where a father holding his child's hand in public doesn't make everyone act as if we are witnessing a magic trick. I want a Barbados where we nod in recognition of good fathers because we know that this is the standard that we have set. Earlier, it was said that we weren't, the honorable member, the opposition senator, Senator Worrell, mentioned that, you know, he wasn't sure if it was the role of the law or this should come first. But the reality is that we know in Barbados that some laws have allowed us to shift from certain mindsets to others. We could look at things like the autonomy of women to make decisions about their bodies, and also the law that removed bastards from the books. The idea that law should encourage cultural changes because that is what we are in the business of, creating space for progress. And so I want to see boys seeing their fathers changing diapers, cook dinners, comfort tears, and the tenderness that does not take away from manhood, something that we typically act like it does. And so we have been conditioned by quiet traditions, a lot that we rarely pause to consider and we rarely question. They rarely announce themselves, but they still shape our everyday lives. These old traditions and ideas are not always loud, they are polite, dressing themselves in love oftentimes, but their most endearing disguise is normalcy. That it is, and it always has been, and so it should be, and we ought to just allow it to occur. And so the way that we talk about caregiving as help is one of those traditions, as if the woman is supposed to do these things. Well, the man is supposed to lead the household and the woman is just there to help. And childbearing and taking care of the household, things that are jobs, things that take time and effort and energy and strength, that's just how it's supposed to be, offering assistance. So let me confess that oftentimes I tell people that I don't like cooking. I don't like cooking. It is not the top thing on my list any day. I will eat out before I cook every day if I could, much to my mother's frustration. But the response that I get is, how do you expect to have a husband and children? And so if my value is tied to the meals that I prepare and the domestic roles that I assume, Mr. President and colleagues, I want to say that if the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, then that is not love, that is survival. And it should not depend on my cooking because we have a bigger problem. I also want to say that in a modern Barbados, both men and women can feed themselves. And so this bill is more about leave. It is also about liberation and reshaping what family means, what fatherhood looks like, and what equality feels like in daily life. Because these old ideas that we have do not simply harm women, it also disenfranchises and impoverishes men. The way how we talk about fatherhood and how we talk about masculinity, they steal from men the freedom to be gentle. It steals from them their ability to be vulnerable and the deep the joy that comes from being involved in family life. We often tell men, society that is, that men should provide, but they should not feel, and to lead, but not lean, to protect, but we don't offer them spaces to connect. And in doing so, it deprives our homes of balance, our children of presence, and our societies of a real sense of wholeness. And so when we deny men the right to care, we deny families the fullness of love. But when we give them permission and grant them through the bill that we are here today to debate, homes become gentler, and we see it in general in our communities. And so this is not just legislative housekeeping, we are also doing some cultural house cleaning. We want to ensure that care is something that is everybody feels as though they have the right and the privilege to offer, allowing men to bond with their children in the earliest of days. It begins to normalize that fatherhood is not symbolic or just about money, and that motherhood is just not about martyrdom and sacrifice. It allows us to escape outdated expectations from gender scripts, and it makes it a lot more balanced, more dignified, and allows for us to live more true. And so this bill really replaces a framework around a single gendered experience to one that recognizes what modern family life is. It moves away, because the bill prior focused on maternity. There is no mention of fathers in the previous bill, and it moves towards where we recognize that fathers and care indeed is a shared human responsibility. I want to say, because I've heard it uttered externally, and maybe it is for headlines or political points, but the bill does not seek to concern itself with when or whether a woman should have a child, but rather it concerns itself with that whenever a family is formed with a child, however that looks like, that the law stands to support and not to judge. It means that fathers are allowed to father without judgment and without waiting on the whims and fancies of an employer to decide, yes, you could have a day, you could have 3 days or a week, because there are companies that grant time off currently for paternity. And so if the last century of labor reform and what we have done has been to free women to enter the workforce, then the next set has to focus on allowing for men to enter the home and not to define masculinity by absence. And so the bill, and I keep saying this, changes that story. One of the things, and I heard it mentioned before, that I look forward to seeing, because I think oftentimes we act as though bills should be perfect from the outset and it should cover every circumstance that may arise. And we should see legislation not as a ceiling, but in every instance as the floor. And the reason for that is because if we think about what is occurring in the world of work in terms of AI and remote and the gig economy, it demands for us to continue this conversation, because we have to continue updating it to match that. And so I am certain, and I look forward to being able, of course, to expand for men who unfortunately face the sad circumstance where their partner passes during pregnancy or within childbirth, are also granted the length of time, because this bill is about compassion. And so ensuring that we continue to build on that is very important. The last thing I want to focus on is that this bill calls on us to reimagine labor itself. For too long, a lot of times we treat the workers as though they are, when they leave the workplace or when they arrive at the workplace, it is a separate and distinct person. And so the work of caregiving and of supporting households is something that has to be integrated in how we treat the workers, because you are a whole person. And so what we are doing is correcting that distortion, that fathers or mothers will go home and they don't need the support anymore, or that care work is not work, so it's not as important. And so we are ensuring that families are more stable and that communities are stronger, because when homes are healthy, workplaces function better. And it's not a social luxury, it is an economic logic. And so this government has focused on people-centered labor policies that recognize that justice at work cannot exist without justice in the home. And so we value not only production, but also reproduction. The old ideas about gender roles have cost us a lot, Mr. President. It has cost us in burnout, in broken homes, and in lost potential. This bill writes a new story. And so the well-being of families is not a private matter, but a national strategy. And so it tells employers that their duty does not end at the office door, and it tells every mother, father, and caregiver that they are seen, valued, and supported. As we look past this bill, beyond this bill, because as I said, we need to continue building on the bill, of course, as the world of work continues to evolve. We aspire to the ideal, but we ground ourselves in reality. There are things that we aspire to, but we simply cannot do in the moment because we may not have the capacity, or we may need to test the boundaries of our social infrastructure in order to make sure that when we make a commitment to the people, that we can keep that commitment. And so we are imagining a Barbados where family and equality sits together, where employers know that men are expected to be engaged, and indeed men know, fathers know, expecting fathers know that they are expected to be involved at the start and all the way to the finish. And if I am any example, there really is no finish, because I still call my mother at the slightest inconvenience. And so it means that we recognize that paternity, as mentioned before, and fatherhood is not just something that you do and, a child happens and then sometimes you drop off cash and sometimes you see them, but that you know that you are supposed to be involved. And we have men around Barbados who set that example and show that, but once again, we are working to make it a rule and not an exception. And so we're not talking about fatherhood so that it is whispered about anymore, so you feel ashamed or you don't want to do certain things with your child because of how society may view you, but we celebrate fatherhood for what it is. Where family-friendly policies are not something that we have to negotiate, because every employer sees it as an imperative for their business. I'm talking about a Barbados that invests in the well-being of Barbadians and families, for productivity, stability, and compassion is standard. And so I imagine a Barbados long after this bill is passed and long after this debate has concluded, that recognizes that today was a great step towards ensuring that we reframe how we view fatherhood, how we view families, how we view the way that we work together, and ultimately how we view care. Because, Mr. President, I believe that if we showed care a lot more, a lot of the challenges that we are having would cease to be. And so, with those few words, I want to say that when we build a nation that honors those truths, we are not just modernizing our laws, we are fulfilling the promise of progress to Barbados. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Trent. Senator Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with your permission, I would like to say a few words about a recently concluded event. I think that when we hear repeated that we are at times punching above our weight, our recent experience at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Conference, I would say displays that, sir. And I'll be brief and say that I think that the organization was excellent, and I think that persons like you, the President of the Senate, the Speaker and the other place, and the Clerk of Parliament, and all the organizing committees must have done tremendous work for it to turn out the way it was. I'd like to congratulate you all. With regard to the bill before us, Mr. President, I do not have a lot to say. Senator Worrell and the leader of government business have done very good jobs of laying it out, almost in a brotherly fashion. However, Mr. President, I would like to make a few comments about Section 6 of the legislation. It begins by pointing out that the minimum period of leave shall be no less than 14 weeks. And in Section 2, it's 2A, it speaks specifically for persons whose confinement took place before being granted maternity leave. As a doctor, I presume that means for somebody who had a premature birth. But I'm conflicted because of the conflict in the legislation. If we accept that prematurity is a special state, and the newborn requires special care that's extended, because essentially when you reach 3 months as a premature baby that was born at 28 weeks, you're not really being born. But there's no provision in this legislation that definitely assures the mother that she will have extended leave. It actually says that if the female employee so desires, but certainly that couldn't have been the intention. It couldn't have been the intention that a mother who delivers a premature infant that's in the ICU for 10 weeks would be given the option that if she wanted, she could have additional leave. I can't imagine that was the intent. So I would like to suggest that we should probably look to revise it. Another thing, Mr. President, is it does not make any provision for children who are fostered or adopted by families. And it speaks to birth, specifically to birth. And I would like to suggest that there should be some amendment or some other way of finding it so that children who are also adopted can be treated like all other children in terms of the parenting and the bonding and everything that must occur. And my last point, Mr. President, relates to the opposite end of the spectrum, where someone is now what we call in medicine post-dates. In other words, you deliver after the estimated dates. And it gives that person not the option, it says the leave shall be extended. So on one hand, for a premature baby, the mother has a choice of extension, but if you deliver late, you have to get the extension. And I think it really needs to be sorted out, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nair. Senator Andeli Borges.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me for what will be a very brief intervention. I stand to support the bill this afternoon for all of the reasons articulated by my colleagues, but also because it represents a continued investment by the government of Barbados in the care economy and in the expansion of social policy aimed at benefiting the average Barbadian and in the fine tradition of the Barbados Labour Party, Mr. President, improving the lives of all. Sir, the bill does a number of things. It, as I indicated, continues that tradition of social progress for which this government is well known. It faces, or in some tangential way, helps us to face what is one of the country's most pressing issues, that issue of population replenishment. We know the statistics well, that Barbados unfortunately has the lowest population growth rates in CARICOM, and that the birth and fertility rates are below the levels of replenishment, Mr. President. And, I'm sorry? Replacement, my apologies. Thank you. I put it to you, Mr. President, that it really is policies like these, policies that look at the perennial issues of this country and find solutions for them that will improve things like the birth rate in this country and ultimately improve the lives of Barbadians. I heard the Honorable Senator Worrell earlier in the framing of his comments, certainly in my own interpretation, seem to avert the notion of perhaps not enough investment. And I do apologize if I'm misquoting you, although that was my interpretation. And I think that there is nothing perhaps further from the truth that this legislation, Mr. President, sits alongside a number of interventions by the government of Barbados that seek to improve the care economy. We see the construction of a geriatric hospital, Mr. President. There is a robust community elder care program. Sir, there just 2 weeks ago, the Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs broke ground on a respite center for the elderly and persons with disabilities. And these are just some of the investments that the government of Barbados has made in ensuring that we create an ecosystem of care that supports persons at all levels, and that we take a life cycle approach to the provisioning of care. There was a time in this country, Mr. President, where we talked about care only at or near the end of life, when you were old, or perhaps at the beginning and the end of your life. And like my colleague indicated, that much of the care responsibility on either side of the spectrum rested and resided primarily with women. This legislation goes some way, Mr. President, in making a difference in that regard, and for that, the government ought to be commended. The legislation principally, as the objects and reasons indicate, is about the provisioning of leave to both men and women for the care of children at a particular stage in their life. And I want, Mr. President, that while I commend this legislation and commend men, particularly men of my generation, for their increasing and active participation in the caring and rearing of their children, to also underscore the fundamental importance of other systems that support, sir, the caring and rearing of children. And by that I mean that there are too many instances in this country where fathers are precluded from the caring and the rearing of their children by virtue of the approach taken by courts in this country that certainly in my view on these matters do not move fast enough. And certainly in my view, that approach or of a lack of efficiency certainly endangers the Barbadian family. It endangers, Mr. President, the very relationship building that we seek to inspire by virtue of this through the constituent parts of this legislation. And it is a matter, Mr. President, that we have to fix because children are the victims of that lack of efficiency, for want of a better term. Fathers are the victims of that lack of efficiency. And if we believe, as it is clear that we do, that the strength and continuity of the Barbadian family is essential to our national development, those are issues that we must fix. Quite similarly, Mr. President, I would wish to call on the private sector to perhaps first to commend the private sector agencies that in the running of their entities support families and support care responsibilities. By that same token, Mr. President, I think that a great deal more can be done, and certainly that a great deal more actors in the private sector space can join the cause of supporting women in the early parts of child rearing and caring, but also supporting the sandwich generation, Mr. President, of Barbadians who also have responsibilities for parents and grandparents as they face so many of the serious challenges that ail them. And so it certainly is my hope that the private sector is cognizant of these needs, and that as time goes on, there will be continued investments in ensuring the stability of the nation, Mr. President, through the required support. I did indicate that it was going to be a brief intervention, Mr. President. Permit me to end by commending the government of Barbados for building and fortifying an ecosystem of care through a series of social policy interventions, and I don't need to repeat them for you now, but through child protection legislation and disability legislation and elderly policy, and ultimately this piece of legislation, Mr. President. And, sir, as we recognize that the stability of the Barbadian family is essential to the continued growth of this country, may we continue to do everything in our power to keep it strong, stable, and ever thriving. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrew Du Bois. Senator the Honourable Lyndall Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am happy to be able to participate in this particular debate. I am the proud father of two lovely daughters, and I remember, and I'm speaking now about back in the 90s, the 80s, when I had my first daughter. I remember particularly how excited and happy I was to be able to rush home during the lunch hour, just to be able to have a little look, a little play with that kid, even at those age of a few days. I, of course, in my time, would not have had the benefit of being able to claim paternity leave. But, and so I recognize then how important it was for a father to also be able to put in the time, particularly in those initial weeks. And you don't realize it, but in those initial weeks when the child is beginning to sense things, begin to see things, and begin to recognize voices and so on. And that kind of bonding, I believe, in my opinion, stays with you and that child for a lifetime. And so I want to commend the relevant ministry and, of course, the government, of course, for bringing this legislation and updating it and modernizing it to where it is, because I think it is important as we look to improve on things which we think are important for good family life in Barbados, that we recognize that these are one of the issues. And we recognize that, Mr. President, the level of issues which we have with our young people today, particularly, especially among young men, I've heard it said and repeated often that one of the issues is really the lack of that paternal connection in the household. And so I am calling on the men, and I am merely echoing all of the speeches, nearly all of the speeches which, and speakers that would have gone before, who have been calling on the men to step up to the plate and use this now and recognize that this is your opportunity to really bond and to build with your offspring. I remember, and I don't hear about it now, but in the days of an organization called MISA that was spearheaded by the then Ralph Boyce, who has gone to the great beyond. But one of the things I remember that he was particularly strong on is for the men to be able to have that kind of access with their children. This is another piece I see in the puzzle of getting men to take on that responsibility, to be able to play their part in the upbringing and the upkeep of their children. And so again, I want to stress a comment that was made again by nearly all the previous speakers, that men need to recognize that this is not, this grant of paternity leave is not an opportunity to have a little extra vacation or to go and to lime on the block with the other fellows or to do all other things except that it is given so that you can give the kind of emotional support to the mother who would have just come out of a very stressful childbearing situation, to give the kind of support to the child that is necessary in those initial days and weeks, and to recognize that that is what this leave is really designed to do. We don't want that, having gotten this legislation to this point, and I have to say that, you know, in doing a little research for this particular debate, I recognize that in the Caribbean, there's probably only one other country right now, maybe two, that has paternity leave on the statute books. So we in Barbados, I see this as showing leadership in this area in the Caribbean, and that as a government, the government is prepared to bring Barbados into the modern world. As a matter of fact, you know, even when you do the little research on in some of the first world countries in Europe and the UK and so on, you find that paternity legislation is not, in all cases, on the statute books. In the UK, for example, you know, they give, I think they give a few days, perhaps 3 days or something like that, as paternity leave. So, in a way, you can say that Barbados is now gone past some of those first world countries in terms of putting this kind of social legislation on the books. And I think the government is to be congratulated in taking that kind of leadership role. Mr. President, there is just one little thing which I looked at in this legislation and which I thought I would mention, and that has to do with the period of time in which a person must be employed before they can claim the paternity or maternity leave. I think it's covered under sections 4 and 5 of the legislation. And what I was saying is, I understand there has to be some kind of time involved before eligibility. After all, you can't walk into a job today and expect that you should want to be able to apply for maternity or paternity leave. But I think perhaps it is an area which government can look at as we go forward and see how that can be adjusted. And I say that because if you take, for example, a sector like the construction sector, where there's a rapid turnover of staff, mainly men, it's going to be mainly the males, but a very rapid turnover of staff. You probably go and you work with a company while they're doing a project for 6 months, and when that is done, you go and we work with another company that's working on another project. So you don't have that continuous period where you are with an employer for 12 months. And therefore, in that situation, those men working in that industry may find themselves a little bit disadvantaged. Now, no legislation is perfect. We know, as I said before, this is really quite a bit of new legislation. It will need to be adjusted and amended as we go forward and as we learn more. And this is something that certainly we can look forward to. There are other things that we would need to look at as well, and they're going to creep in as we come along. I mean, I throw it out, for example, as the world changes, how do you deal with things like same-sex couples? Those are issues that will arise, and we will have to collect the data to be able to analyze it, to be able to determine how we adjust the legislation to be able to deal with those kind of issues. But I think this is a good start. I think it's a good piece of legislation. It's certainly not contentious, and I am happy to be able to support this legislation. Mr. President, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Any more speakers? If none of that, Senator Cummins to wrap up. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, permit me to focus a little bit on a much more narrower perspective on the bill than my colleagues. The bill in reality is an employment statute in the same vein as the statute it intends to repeal. And while my colleagues have focused on some of the broad social development objectives, population concerns, and even the enhancement of the role of men in families, this is, after all, a simple employment statute as intended to make greater provision for the rights of women in the workplace having given birth to a child, and to make new provision for men, and indeed provision for the family to take leave collectively, which is a great step forward, but it is, after all, an employment statute. And I propose to make a few brief comments on the strengthening of that legal framework and to answer some of the questions posed by some of my colleagues in relation to why the bill is framed in the way it is framed and how we can look potentially at any legislative amendments in the future based on how the rollout of this new legislative scheme works over the next couple of years. But, sir, I hold the view that the law fastens not on principles, but on remedies. And I'm sure that there are persons in this room who have heard me make that statement in a different forum. And they're hiding their face from me as we speak. But that is not necessarily a real popular legal maxim. The law fastens on, not on principles, but on remedies. It is a more practical statement of the reality that, in effect, if the law doesn't bring a resolution to a solution or a problem, then it has no legitimacy. And in this case, I want us to focus a little bit on what it is that we are intending to do. Now, I will go straight to the issue about the 12 months and why there is a period for a woman to be employed by the same employer for 12 months. This is not to penalize any women who have moved from job to job or to disincentivize people from leaving work. All throughout the employment legislation in Barbados, most of the rights accrue after 1 year in a job, if not all. Senator Worrell made reference to holiday. Under the Holidays with Pay Act, that right accrues after 1 year. What I believe the Senator Worrell may have misconstrued was that your right to a payment can accrue even before the year has elapsed. And if your employment is terminated, you're entitled to a payment equivalent for that period for which you have worked. But you don't have the right to a holiday before the year expires. Under the Employment Rights Act, another employment piece of legislation brought in by the last administration, a person does not have the right not to be unfairly dismissed unless that person has been working for a year. So there is some consistency, and I believe I would say there's some internal consistency where there are rights accruing within the sphere of employment legislation in Barbados to anchor this with the fact that a person should be employed for a year before any benefits under the legislation, under the National Insurance, under the Holidays with Pay Act or the Employment Rights Act. All of these are predicated on the basis of an employee working for a year. But I want to make the point, Mr. President, that if indeed this is a situation where the payment for maternity benefits comes directly from the National Insurance Fund, short of any perceived disruption in the business of an employer, then it really doesn't matter if the employee is working with that particular employer for a year, if the employee has made a number of contributions to the National Insurance Fund, having been employed previously. Because if it were that the employer was paying or had to pay a maternity benefit, like how they will have to pay holiday with pay, then you can prorate that to the period of employment at that particular place of employment. So perhaps when we are talking about changes or we're looking to see how this act is rolled out, we can consider relaxing not necessarily the length of period for a year, but removing the requirement that you have to be working with that particular employer for a year. Basically what I'm saying, Mr. President, where an employee has been working and making contributions to the National Insurance Fund and making what we consider under the National Insurance Act and regulations, the minimum contributions, perhaps even if they move from one employer to another and they continue, there's some continuity in the benefits that they are paying, then they should be able to qualify even if they change their job. And that would take away the specter of somebody having to consider whether they need to leave and go and get another job as opposed to having a child. And I think that is a better way of dealing with it rather than just reducing it from, say, 12 months to 6 months or anything of that sort. The important thing is that this is an insurance managed fund from which contributions are being paid in by working people. And therefore, the ultimate consideration in my humble submission would be the number of contributions the employee has made and not necessarily the time that they have spent at a particular place of employment. But I wanted to correct the perception that there are ways in which you can lower the entitlement to benefits for under a year as a solution to the perceived problem by Central World. Because in reality, that is not the case. Where the employment is terminated, your benefits accrue based on the time you have spent. But if you're ordinarily working in an environment, a place of employment, you're not going to get those benefits until a year has passed. And that is a consistency in the employment legislative framework that if we were to follow his solution, I don't understand how we can have some consistency in our legislation and just have that knee-jerk reaction. But I understand why he might be saying so, because this debate has gone on in other places in a way in which when I started to look at this bill, I thought I was actually dealing with something that was almost demonic, that was trying to marginalize women and do all the things that you hear in the roadside parliament and all those other places. But I want to assure the country, sir, that this is indeed revolutionary. It takes us beyond where we are. I have not heard any of the speakers really speak to the fact that we are extending the period for which maternity leave benefits for women, and that is something that should be applauded. But I also want to add my voice to the concerns raised about foster children. I come up in a family in which my grandmother had to go for her husband's daughter, who was born to a woman who died in childbirth. And she raised that child as her own. That perhaps is not going to be as common as it was back in those days, in these times. But indeed, where grandparents, aunts, uncles have to step in when parents have died or become disabled, can't work, there needs to be some consideration of how we can extend the benefits under this legislation, because we have not broadened the legislative scope for this to make it a family leave bill and not an employment of women maternity leave act. We have not broadened the scope, and therefore perhaps we now need to look at a more family-oriented conditioning of how we apply the legislation. Because, as I said, the law fastens not the principles, but the remedies. And if we are going to do all the social developmental engineering that we have spoken about, Mr. President, we're going to have to deal with the reality of the family that we have in the country. Again, there is a prevalence of people having children from more than one woman. That is a Barbadian reality. And those fathers are required by the courts to perform the duties as a father to all of their children. And it is not a legitimate excuse that I have family obligations already existing to exclude them from any family situation. The courts will require all fathers, or all men, I should say, who have been adjudged to be, or determined or deemed to be the father of a child, to make their contributions to the development of that child's welfare. So, I would want to humbly suggest that some consideration in the future be given to where a person, a man, has fathered more than one child within a 12-month period, that he will be able to benefit from that. So that if it is that a child is supposed to be born with a father, and that is one of the social developmental objectives of the legislation, then I don't think that the child should be penalized because the father has taken up with another woman in less than a 12-month period. We laugh at these things, but it's the reality of a lot of people. I can very remember being in court in Old Town, where there was an argument as to how many children this man had, because he was saying he had 3 children, but the lady was saying he had 2, so he should be able to support mine. He was saying, I have 3 other children. She was adamant he had 2. The magistrate gave a conditional order, interim order. And at the end of it, the man looked very upset. They said he can go. The next case was called, he stood in his place. The clerk said, for the second time, you can go, sir. The man stood up. He looked back to make sure the lady left the court. And as soon as she exited the court, he said, this case is also mine. I did not want her to know that this lady had a child for me.
That's what he was.
But he preferred that to happen so that the order was made, but he in fact had 4 children. But that happens, that is the reality, and it may sound funny, but I saw that as an experience very, very early on in my legal career. So I am making the plea that when we have these situations, the law has to deal with them as well. We can't say it's a good thing for a father to play a role in the early developmental life of his child, but say, well, if you have more than one child, you can only choose, you have to pick which one. We can't be saying both things at the same time. This is not to encourage profligacy, or what Bajans will call the sweet daddy mentality, or sugar daddy mentality. But at the end of the day, we are talking about ensuring that the rights of a parent in their employment are secured when they are taking care of their family obligations at the time of the birth of a child. That is the paramount consideration which should override any operationalizing of the facets of this legislation. The importance of the bond between parent and child in those early formative stages should therefore guide how the law is applied. It should guide how the law is amended and operationalized in the future. Sir, when I got married almost 20 years ago, in his sermon, Reverend Paris, now Bishop-elect Reverend Paris, preached from the book of Deuteronomy and stressed about the importance of a family being a cohesive unit in the early formative stages. It's never left me. Deuteronomy 24, verse 5 says, when a man have taken a new wife, he shall not go to war, neither shall he be charged with any business, but he shall be free at home for 1 year, and cheer up his wife which he have taken.
Did you get that now?
I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Nichols. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank all of the honourable speakers who have presented on this bill. If there's one thing on which I think we have reached unanimity, is that this is a family leave bill, and it strengthens and supports the family structure in Barbados. There were a number of recommendations and queries raised by the legislation. Some of them were repeated, so I'm going to attempt to treat to them all in one. I believe that Senator Nichols, in his presentation just now, spoke about the rationale for the 12-month period, vesting it in the employment rights legislation, or suite of employment rights legislation. And so I will leave that as having been covered adequately. I would, however, also want to speak to the recommendations that have been made by many members, specifically about the inclusions that could be incorporated. And I did seek, in my initial introduction of the bill, to speak about the fact that you have to be able to rationalize where there is a start and what the evolution of the process would look like. The inclusion of things like foster children and adopted children over time will have to be assessed, and that has been a commitment already, and I believe that the Honourable Minister, who, along with his team, must be commended for introducing and piloting this bill, and I want to do so at this time. Thank you very much to the Ministry with responsibility for Labour and Social Security that has anchored this process. They are here with us today. But as they piloted this bill through the other place, the Honourable Minister did indicate that this is a first, this is a floor and not a ceiling. It is the introduction and not the end. And it is a draw not on the same purse that pays other expenses, as has been mentioned by Senator Worrell in his political commentary. However, it draws on the national insurance scheme and not on central government. And there is a commitment that as we extend the maternity benefit and we include the paternity benefit, that the scheme will assess how this extension has been impacting on the fund, and then be in a position over time to make any evolutionary changes that may need to be considered. And that is a hallmark of responsible governance, to make sure that we protect the lifeline that we refer to as the national insurance scheme. So, Mr. President, I want to also acknowledge the recommendations that have been made also by, I don't want to call them recommendations also really, but the comments that have been made by Senator Rogers, Senator Trim, Senator Maynard, I want to just pause there for a moment, but the clause to which Senator Maynard referred, which is clause 6, does not have any reference at all to how it was interpreted by the Honorable Senator, and I did take the opportunity to consult with the Ministry with responsibility for labor, and that is not to be the interpretation in terms of children who are born prematurely and the length of time. That is not what this section of the legislation referred to, and so I just wanted to make that correction for the record. And then to express appreciation for the commentary on social policy raised by Senator Andrene Boyce and young Senator Trim, and the same for Senator Lindell Nurse, and of course the legal explanations provided by Senator Gregory Nichols. Now, as I close, Mr. President, I just want to make one point that has been made by all of the honorable members who have spoken in different ways. We have spoken about the importance of family life. We've spoken about the importance of fathers being included in the lives of children. We've spoken about the importance of that bonding period and how that is important to continue even up until this day, where we engage with family life with the mother and the father as the foundation of the family. We spoke also about the law courts. Senator Nichols spoke about the law courts, and others mentioned the law courts as well. And I think that we all here have agreed that the role of fatherhood is not to be diminished. And I want to take the opportunity as I close to appeal to mothers. Do not weaponize your children. Do not weaponize your children against their fathers. Don't do it. You at some point in time loved, were attracted to, were interested in, were committed to this man. If it did not work out, it did not work out between you, the adult, the woman, and the man. The child who is a product of that relationship is entitled to have the benefit of both parents in their lives as long as both parents are willing to be there. We have long seen too many instances, like in the magistrates' courts that we heard being raised by Senator Nichols and others, where mothers are withholding access to children. This legislation speaks about families. It speaks about leave for fathers to engage in the same way, even if in an abridged version, with their children from the time they are born and for the duration of their lives. Our courts are not meant to be used in a way that is a weapon against fatherhood. It is not. I can tell you, like Senator Rogers, what it is to have a single child and to know what it is when I go back to work. Her father will probably take her with him where he goes, true. Her hair may not be plaited the way I may do it. She may not be dressed in the way I may want her to be dressed. He may not hold her in the way that I would hold her, but that does not mean it is not a parent who is taking care of a child over whom he is protected. I remember when the child starts to teeth, you may decide that you want to treat to that teething in a certain way. When a child is tired and colicky, you may treat to that. Fathers and mothers do parent differently, but it does not mean that one is less than. This legislation today is a part of that social and that cultural change that so many of us have spoken about. It brings fathers into equivalence with mothers. It starts to speak to the question of mothers accepting the importance of fathers in the lives of their children from the day of birth onwards. And I will say this to you, a child that you have weaponized from birth and at different points in their lives, they grow up. They grow up and they miss what you denied them and they never had the opportunity to have when they see it in others. They remember the weaponization and they crave for that longing, that belonging. They crave for that relationship with their fathers that you have denied them, and they will resent you for it. Let us give children their due. Let us raise children in this society as part of a community, as part of a village, and let us start in our homes, and let us start from at birth with this family leave bill. And with those few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I wish to revert to the appointment of a temporary deputy president of this chamber, and I beg to move that we nominate Senator the Honorable Lyndall Nurse to assume this role for the duration of today's sitting.
The question is, that Senator the Honorable Lyndall Nurse be elected Deputy President of the Senate for the remainder of this sitting. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Nurse, thank you for agreeing to serve. You are so elected.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Senate is now in committee.
Mr. Chairman, permission to take the bill in parts.
Permission granted.
Clauses 1 to 9.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that clauses 1 through 9 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 9 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 10 to 16.
Mr. President, Mr. Chair, I beg to move that clauses 10 through 16 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 10 to 16 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Schedule.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. And all those honorable senators in favor please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Deputy President has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Those honorable senators in favor please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Family Leave Act 2025.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Family Leave Act 2025. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we do suspend the sitting of the Honorable Senate until 3:10 p.m.
The question is that the Honorable Senate be suspended, the sitting be suspended until 3:15 p.m. today. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Because the ayes have it, this sitting is suspended until 3:15 p.m. today.